So is this, no, I did the wrong one. Creepy. Please show it on YouTube at the minute. Fantastic. Okay, we made it. Right. Thank you everyone for bearing with our slight delay.
Fascinating water.
There was a lot of people who wanted to be here who couldn't be here, so Eleanor was asking for the idea to look at the case for broadcasting the ICS so that's what we saw. So hopefully that'll work. It's a very great pleasure to introduce Rachel Mairs today, who's currently Associate Professor of Classical and European Writing after having been at Oxford and NYU. Amongst other posts, also at Brown. Rachel's the first person who came to mind when we designed this seminar on the kind of history and practice of classical archaeology in the Middle East. There's been a number of books that she's written recently. Rachel works largely in the Hellenistic forms, but Archaeologists, Tourists, and Interpreters came out a couple of years ago with Bloomsbury. She's actually got a more recent book than this I discovered this morning with Bloomsbury, also on archaeology and gardens. So I'm looking very much forward to the
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to Jan and poor Zena, who's unwell, for the invitation to be here. It's a fabulous seminar series on this topic, and I only regret that I can't make it to more of these as well. I'm sure most people in the room get my intent with the title, which is, of course, a play on Colin Renfrew's Archaeology and Language, but focusing more on archaeologists and language. And what I'm particularly interested in is the engagement between archaeologists of the Middle East, not just of the classical period, but of all periods, with modern colloquial languages within the Middle East. In addition to, or occasionally instead of, knowledge of ancient languages as well. But I'd like to start with an anecdote. So we're at Carchemish on the border between Syria and Turkey, the modern border between Syria and Turkey in 1912. And Leonard Woolley has gone out to start the excavations at Carchemish and discovered that the local Ottoman official, the Kaymakam, is not going to let him start work because of a problem with his permit. So Woolley goes to the local town, he has an appointment with the official, and he says, we've got the permit from Constantinople for this site, what's the problem? And the official points out that the permit that they actually have is not made out in Woolley's name, it's made out in Hogarth's name instead. And the official says to Woolley, well, I've got no idea who you are, but going by the letter of the permit here, I shouldn't be allowing you to start digging. And Woolley protests. He says that he is acting as Hogarth's representative and that he should therefore be allowed to start work. At this point, Woolley comes up with the idea that he does have one piece of paper that he can show this official, which will hopefully give him some position of respectability, which is a letter from the British Museum saying that he is Hogarth's representative on this dig. And the official looks at this letter and says, well, that's great and everything, but it's in English, and I don't know English, and this has no authority here. Woolley comes up with the idea that he would translate this English letter from the British Museum into French, and a locally available interpreter would then translate it from French into Turkish for the official. At which point the official, I think I can understand his frustrations here, says, I shouldn't trust such a translation, and until the British Museum issues this order in Turkish, I shall pay no attention to it. So Woolley puts a gun to his head. let's pause for a second and reflect on that. We have a story here which Woolley is telling himself only a few years later of frustrations and language difficulties in dealing with officialdom in opening up archaeological excavations. But there is a violent aspect to this encounter. There is the potential of force being used. Woolley says quite clearly that he wouldn't, of course, have fired a gun. He wouldn't have shot the local official, but the official had no way of knowing this. So he was able to use the potential of violence lying behind this encounter as a way of getting his way as an archaeologist. I've been thinking about this story a lot recently in the context of some ongoing research projects about European and American archaeologists in the Middle East and North Africa in the 19th century, and the way in which they engaged and did not engage with local languages that were spoken by the workers on their sites and by officialdom with whom they had to deal in conducting their digs. And this has had a couple of what my bosses in preparation for the ref would like to call research outputs so far, or books in slightly different parlance. One is the one which Jen kindly introduced, which was co-authored with my colleague Maya Muratov, which is looking at archaeologists and tourists and their use of interpreters and language intermediaries in the colonial Middle East. And the other one, which is out now in paperback, is a more focused biographical and archival study of one particular language mediator who worked between locals and visiting archaeologists and travellers in Palestine and also in Egypt and Sudan. Within this, I suppose I have two areas of focus. Language as a mediating tool between archaeologists and other European visitors and locals, and also embodied mediators, interpreters, people acting as go-betweens and fixers on archaeological sites, whether between archaeologists or between visiting foreigners who are just simply touring these sites for their own interest. And the figure of the dragoman, a word which I imagine most people who've worked in the Middle East are quite familiar with, the figure of the dragoman shows up time and time again in Western visitors' accounts of their engagement with Middle Eastern antiquities in the 19th century. And the dragoman becomes kind of a stock figure. And I give you just an example here on the slide. This is from a comic travel log written by an American called George Ade in 1906. George Ade was a friend of Mark Twain, and a lot of his writings are really in quite a similar vein. And he talks in a sort of a semi-affectionate but still quite frustrated way about the figure of dragoman in his visits to archaeological sites in Egypt. As you'll see here, I'm not going to read out the full passage on the slide. He talks about these dragomans driving people like a dun-driven cow, is his analogy for how foreigners are when being guided by them. He takes absolute charge of you, either by making specious representations or boldly assuming authority. And when you start out to visit the famous mosque of old Medulla Oblongata, I hope everybody realises that's a made-up name, or some other defunct celebrity, you finish up in a junk shop for the sale of antiques, all of which are personally guaranteed by the dragoman because he's a silent partner in the business. Now, Ade has some interesting historical reflections on the figure of dragoman. And on the slide here, we have a cartoon which appears in the same book, which depicts Herodotus and his dragoman. And from Ade's perspective, the encounter of Herodotus with Egypt is one of a Western tourist or antiquarian looking at these sites and, in Ade's view, taking the word of locals a bit too trustingly on what the significance of monuments are, what inscriptions say, and things of that sort. So I give you here the relevant passage from Herodotus's second book, where he talks about the things that are written on the pyramids and about the fact that these have been explained to him by someone there. And in Ade's view, this breed of dragoman has not changed since 500 BC. And he gives you this image here of Herodotus sitting there cross-legged, credulously, as an Egyptian with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, explains the hieroglyphs on the pyramids to him and says, Herodotus put it all down without batting an eye. So there we have a popular perspective on the credulousness or otherwise of Herodotus and other ancient non-Egyptian visitors to Egypt. It's difficult to get the perspective of local agents such as dragomans who engaged with archaeologists and visitors who had archaeological interests. And there are a couple of ways in which we can start attempting to do this. There's a biographical approach which we can have a go at with varying results depending on the individual. And here I think in particular of the Aboudi family, who have been based in and around Luxor and involved in the tourist trade and kind of para-archaeological activities for decades, over 100 years. So on the left-hand side here, we have, this is Muhammad Aboudi, who was the chief dragoman for Thomas Cook in Egypt at some point. He's here explaining hieroglyphs on the walls of the temple at Komombo. And the kind of the dynasty of the Aboudis has carried on. If anyone's been to Luxor, you'll have seen that at least until quite recently, there's the Aboudi family bookstore, which is still there. And indeed, in the early 20th century, the Aboudi family, the dragomans themselves, brought out a guidebook to the archaeological sites of Egypt with a particular focus on Luxor. And these contain in-depth descriptions of the sites, the same kind of things that you would get in Thomas Cook guidebooks or Baedeker or Murray's handbook, things of that sort, explanations of archaeological remains, gleaned from mostly European archaeological excavations, explained by Egyptian dragomans to Europeans. So we can look at intermediaries in that sense, trying to understand this encounter, but the thing I'd like to focus a bit more on today is the question of language. And this is something which is part of an ongoing project of research. I haven't quite followed this through to all of its logical conclusions yet, but it's something I'm having a great deal of fun with because it speaks to frustrations that I think we all have as both as academics and also as travellers going to other countries. The frustration of not being able to communicate and the frustration of trying to acquire a reasonable knowledge of a language to get by without having the time or necessarily the inclination to commit to years of study to become completely fluent in whatever it happens to be. I'd like to come back to George Ade because it's a terrifically entertaining little book, and I think there's some great moments of insight in it as well. And he talks about a friend of his, Mr. Peasley, that he travels with, who is your kind of stereotypical well-off Midwestern businessman abroad who is used to his home comforts and is rather disconcerted about a lot of things that aren't American in his travels in Europe and the Middle East. This is his view of Mr. Peasley's engagement with the Arabic language in Egypt. Mr. Peasley actually bought one of those Arabic at a glance books, and I'll come back to these books in a moment, and started to learn some of the more useful sentences. He said that if he could get Arabic down pat, he would pass as a native and be able to buy things at about half price. After 2 days of hard study, he attempted a conversation with a military policeman standing on the riverbank at Dendera. Mr. Peasley strolled up to him, careless-like, and said, "Ana awaz Arabic kwayisa min shanaruch al-balad." Except that will not have been what Mr. Peasley said. What he will have said will have been his own approximation of things that were written down in an idiosyncratic English transcription in an Arabic phrasebook that he's got. This was supposed to mean, I want a first-class carriage for driving in the town, which indeed it does. I haven't been able to trace exactly which Arabic phrasebook this comes from, but there are a great number of these phrasebooks from the period. The stalwart soldier gazed at Mr. Peasley with the most bewildered look in his jet-black eyes and then began to edge away. "Hold on," said Mr. Peasley. "How about Hal Yel Zamna Gafar Yara Fegwa Bil Tariq?" Mr. Peasley thought he was asking, shall we require a guide or an escort in this time? And the soldier beckoned to us to come over and help him out. Tell them, please, that I'm educated at the Presbyterian Mission, said he, and I speak only English and Arabic. We questioned him later and learned that he took Mr. Peasley to be a Russian. So this is obviously told in jest. It's told as an extended joke, but I think it's potentially quite indicative of the engagement that a lot of foreigners in Egypt and other places in the Middle East will have had with the Arabic language, to the extent that they will have bothered to learn any of it at all. I presume there's quite a lot of people in this room who speak Arabic to a lesser or a greater extent, and indeed for native speakers of European languages learning Arabic, there are quite a number of challenges. In the 19th century, a publishing industry grew up which catered specifically to travellers of various sorts, whether academics or officials or simply pleasure trippers in the Middle East, who wanted to acquire some knowledge of colloquial Arabic in order to get by. Now, of course, there's a long history of the academic study of classical Arabic within Europe. And in this regard, we might think of the Egyptian cleric Rifai al-Tahtawi's trip to Paris between 1826 and 1831, where he met a number of very prominent French Orientalists. And while he was complimentary about the quality of their learning in classical Arabic and their knowledge of Arabic classics, found them completely unable to have a conversation in colloquial Arabic, as indeed one might expect. So something of a publishing industry grew up to cater to people who wanted Arabic to be able to actually speak to people in Egypt. Archaeologists are just one part of this constituency. There are early examples as early as the 1850s being published in Cairo, but I'm a particular fan of this one, which is by Yaqub Nakhla, which was published in Bulaq in Cairo in 1874, which he outlines as being a practical handbook of Arabic for the use of English and American travellers on the Nile, and a useful manual of conversation for the interested natives desirous of acquiring the English language. So he sees this book as going two ways. And his focus is only to a limited extent on grammar. What he wants is people to be able to converse. When you look at the way he outlines the grammar in this is quite typical of a lot of these kinds of Arabic phrase books, whether produced by native Arabic speakers or produced by foreigners, in that the grammatical side of it is exactly like the kind of thing that educated foreigners would have encountered in the Latin or Greek grammars that they were educated with at school. So you get verb paradigms written out like this: I governed, thou governedest. The English use is very archaic, but what this is straight out of a grammar translation style of teaching of classical languages within Europe. Nakhla gives us a number of items of vocab. There's quite a lengthy glossary that goes with this, but my favourite part of the book is the fact that he has some wonderful conversations of things that people might actually use. Some of these phrase books, depending on to whom they cater, can have series of conversations that you just think that there's no way anyone would ever actually need to say this. But Nakhla is very sociable. So we have things like, I would like to have a glass of wine. Will you have another glass of beer? Give me a cup of coffee. Do you like coffee? Give me a cup of tea. Don't put much sugar in it. What will probably be striking to anyone who knows Arabic here is that the words that you have written in Arabic script here are the standard Arabic for these phrases. The things you have in transcription are dialect versions. So there is a difference which is probably going to be invisible to most European users of this book between standard formal classical Arabic and dialect here as well. So Nakhla, as I said, I'm particularly fond of. I think it's quite a useful little book, potentially, and it's got pages on things like starting a game of cards with fellow passengers on the train, things like that. You get more specific ones. From the 1860s, 1870s onwards, you get the beginning of the kinds of books which bill themselves as teach-yourself languages that you still get in the present day. Marlborough's self-taught series is one of these. This is a 1915 version of their Syrian Arabic phrase book. And this is a picture of a copy that I actually have of this, which, as I've noted here, is absolutely pristine. This is a flimsy little paperback, and this has not been dog-eared, taken out round the pyramids and so forth. Well, not the pyramids for Syria, it hasn't been taken out round the ruins of Baalbek or Palmyra with somebody thumbing through this. What I find with this, and I've looked at a great number of copies of these books, whether in libraries, on eBay, various other places. What's striking about this is that you get quite a number of these books which have clearly been bought with great enthusiasm by someone who thinks, I'm going to learn Arabic. And then they open it and they go, oh. And often the reason for them going, oh, is that the explanations of the phonology that you get at the beginning of these books are idiosyncratic. So we're 2 weeks into the Reading term, and I've been teaching an classical Egyptian language class, which has got some of the same phonological repertoire as Arabic does. And I've been trying to teach students how to pronounce things like Ain and Kha and Qaf and so forth. Imagine doing that out of a book like this with somebody who has no experience of learning languages, and you can see the limited results that people get. So naturally, people supplement these things. What I'm finding very fascinating is going through whatever copies of these books I can get. eBay has been a big source, second-hand bookshops. I've raided probably every branch of Oxfam Books in southern England in the search of these things. Looking at ownership inscriptions, looking at who owns these books, and how they work with them. Sometimes you get people who have written extra items of vocabulary. This is one which belonged to, I think, someone must be a British sailor who's got a list of nautical terms in Arabic that he's written in the back of the book. And you get some absolute gems occasionally. This is one where somebody has been practicing their Arabic script up at the top, and it's okay. But they've added some corrections from their experience of actually speaking Arabic in the country. So somebody here has added Mahal al-Adab, place of politeness, as a euphemism for toilet, in correction to the ones they've got there. This one here is interesting because the book itself gives for tobacco pipe peep as a loan word, but this person has discovered that in fact you don't pronounce the p, you pronounce it as b. So beeb would be the way that comes across. And before we come on to archaeologists again, I've just got to share with you my absolute favourite one, which is from a copy of an Arabic phrase book I have. This took a little bit of figuring out. We've got words here for people, family relations, things of that sort. And at the bottom, someone has written snappy piece, which it turns out is a reference to an attractive woman, because on the other side, they've written Helwa and Bint Zayn. So quite what success of any this person had with this Arabic phrase book, I'm just going to leave as a matter of speculation. So these are the kinds of things that were available for foreigners traveling in Egypt and other places in the 19th century. So I was interested from looking at this to think more specifically about the ways in which archaeologists engage with the Arabic language, use these materials and so forth. And we have an absolute gift with this, which is the fact that Flinge's Petrie wrote relatively extensive reflections for the time on his use of the Arabic language and what he thought archaeologists should be doing in terms of managing workforces and also relating to them on a more social level as well. So here we have, this is what staff at the Petrie Museum were told me they call hipster Petrie, standing here outside Giza, looking like it's taken Shoreditch in 2007. But he does have some reflections on the use of Arabic. And he has some reflections on dragomans as well, which are not positive. Now, as we saw with the Aboudi family and with their guidebooks and so forth, you do have a level of professionalism and expertise and knowledge of monuments which grows up among dragomans in Egypt and other places in the Middle East over the course of the 19th century. This is not generally respected by foreigners, especially by archaeologists. And one of the reasons for this is that Petrie is suspicious of dragomans because of their involvement in the tourist and the antiquities trade. So, for example, Francis Galton was going to visit Petrie at Hawara when he was there in the late 1880s. Petrie specifically asks him not to bring a dragoman with him because of the possibility of information getting out about the site. So there's an idea that dragomans are potentially kind of involved in activities to do with antiquities that archaeologists would not be supportive of. The great thing about Petrie for the purposes of this project is that he has lots and lots of advice to other archaeologists on how they should be doing things. And in fact, if anyone has read T. Lawrence's letters with his reflections of working on Petrie, you find that a lot of people who worked under him perhaps find Petrie a little bit opinionated and too eager to share his precise or impose his precise view of how things ought to be done. But he's got advice in various of his publications about what as an archaeologist you should do about dealing with workforces and speaking Arabic. And he is very, very much in favour of archaeologists acquiring as much Arabic as they can. He says the native language is as much needed as in any foreign country. Potentially slightly radical, given that educated Europeans would have been more likely to know other languages such as English, French, or German and use them when travelling. He's saying that the same thing ought to apply when you're in Egypt. But a sufficient amount of colloquial Arabic can be learned in a few weeks. 3 friends of mine have come out with only what could be briefly learned in England, and each has been able in a week or two to make his way sufficiently. Learn first of all what you want in Baedeker's vocabulary. I'm going to show that in the next slide. Refer to Murray, or better to a dictionary for any further words you may want, and absorb the addenda of very common words which come at the end of this chapter. More of that in a minute. Then a week or two in Cairo, talking to the natives as much as possible, would quite suffice to float the active tripper. The main trouble is to catch what is said to you, and for this there's no better practice than listening to short sentences heard in the streets and analysing them. Now, modern studies of second language acquisition are apt to emphasise the extent to which learner motivation has an impact on a person's ability to acquire a language. I'm quite certain that Petrie's method here would work if you were very highly motivated, if you applied yourself. But this is kind of, I think, a best case scenario. It could work, but there are lots of ways in which it might not go as well as Petrie insists that it should. This is Baedeker's Egypt guidebook here, which did indeed, guidebooks of this sort, a bit like Modern Lonely Planet and Rough Guide, did indeed have Arabic words and phrases at the back of them. But this is, and it's probably not very visible in the slide, except to our friends watching on YouTube. I'm just going to read out a couple of the gems among this for those of you in the room, which are Petrie's suggestion of things that you need in addition. So we have words for using the train. Does this train go to Cairo? We've got words about telegraphing and so forth. Then we have show me the snake. Then we have, where's another good one here? I'm very tired, finished. It was very cold in the morning before sunrise. Lots of things that he's clearly used to using on archaeological sites here as well. And this is not entirely ungrammatical. He puts little dots in between separate elements of the Arabic sentence to show how it fits together. And his English is very, very literal. It's translation-ese. It's a calque more than anything else. And then you get occasional gems like al-falahim majnain zaya behind. The peasants are foolish like cattle. Wow. I'm just going to leave that one uncommented upon for a minute, and I'm typing at the wrong computer. So how did Petrie himself actually do this? Well, as you'll have seen from 10 years digging in Egypt, he had quite optimistic views of what a determined person could do. And he did know this from experience. So on his first voyage out to Egypt in 1880, he'd come prepared. He had studied a certain amount of Arabic in a book. Unfortunately, I'm not sure exactly which book he was looking at, but I'm going to work on the assumption that it was probably standard classical Arabic, or at the very least, it was a dialect that was not that of a Moroccan fellow passenger that he attempted to converse with on the boat on the way out. Beyond a few stray remarks on route, weather, etc., mutual goodwill was expressed by odd smiles and What's at play here is, of course, Petrie's, at this point, quite limited command of Arabic. But we've also got to think about things coming into this, such as the fact that he's only been able to learn pronunciation from the book, and of course the big matter of dialect here as well. As anyone who's attempted to speak Pidgin, Egyptian Arabic in Morocco, which I tried to do, know, Moroccans will find it absolutely hilarious. Big differences in dialect that Petrie's not necessarily aware of at this point. And still the following year in Egypt, he's still having issues with using languages. So he gets mugged when he's out one day in Cairo. And when the case comes to court, he's having difficulties interpreting, not just because of his imperfect knowledge of Arabic at this point, but also because Ottoman Turkish is being used in courts and so forth as well. So Petrie in his early days in Egypt is experiencing communication problems, and he's working to resolve them. The great benefit of looking at this with Petrie as well is that we now have in Stephen Quirton's book, Hidden Hands, Egyptian Workforces in the Petrie Excavation Archives, fairly detailed records of how Petrie went about improving his Arabic while he was working on digs. So we have, this is only a couple of years, this is 1884, this is 4 years after his unsuccessful conversation with a Moroccan on the boat. We've got him listening to and recording what his workers are saying in the trenches, trying to figure out what's going on. So he's saying all day the trenches echoed the shouts of Ya ibn al-Kalb, ishtagal, ishtagal, ya bint hawa. None of this is polite, let's just say. In Sahamir, these are colloquial, quite rude things that his workers are shouting to each other, and he's making note of the colloquial language here, and also noting vocab that's new to him. So Hawafi is new to me. Ali says that it means good day, but he can't explain the particular value of such a remark, and it seems to be equal to I've got my eye on you. To all of which they reply contentedly and even cheerfully, Hadar Yasidi Hadar, ready, O my lord, ready. So we have some indication here of the way in which somebody, an archaeologist who was committed to learn Arabic, might be able to make a success of it. And Petrie had quite strong standards for other archaeologists as well. He's done this, so he doesn't see any reason why other people shouldn't. So we find, for example, in Methods and Aims in Archaeology, which comes out in 1904, that he is very clear about saying that these are his instructions for archaeologists going into the field. The spoken language of the country should be fluently acquired for simple purposes. And the reason for this is to be able to direct workmen, make bargains, follow what's going on. And we find here again his mistrust of intermediaries, locals who speak foreign languages. To be dependent on a cook, a dragoman, or a donkey boy is very unsafe and prevents that close study of the workman which is needed for making the best use of him. What he's getting at a bit here again is the question of looting, buying and selling of antiquities outside European-run excavations. But let's come back to Woolley in Carchemish in 1912. T. Lawrence was with Woolley at this trip to the official's office where he put a gun to his head. T. Lawrence, of course, had also worked with Petrie. So he's somebody who had experienced some very different styles of archaeology in the Middle East. Lawrence reflects reasonably extensively on what it's like moving between different archaeological sites in the Middle East in terms of switching Arabic dialect as well. So he gives us a bit of information on what he thinks about Woolley's use of Arabic, his knowledge of dialect and so forth, and says that he has to act interpreter for Woolley. Although Woolley is fairly fluent in Egyptian Arabic, the fact that Lawrence's primary acquisition of Arabic was in the Levant makes it easier for him to switch there. And of course, the question of Lawrence's own knowledge of Arabic is a highly controversial one, which has been much discussed in literature. And I think it's worth looking at Sullivan Moose's work, T. Lawrence, An Arab View, which came out in 1966 and was quite controversial for its revisionist stance on the Lawrence legend. It doesn't attack Lawrence, but it aims to sort of take away a little bit of the aura that surrounds him in the Western popular imagination. And he actually went and interviewed people. He was still able to do this in the 1960s. Interviewed people who'd known Lawrence, whether they were diplomats, as in the letter from Arne Abdelhadi here, or whether they were just locals who'd been with the armies that had been with Lawrence. All of these make it clear, and it's only fair to add that this is Lawrence's own view himself, that his Arabic was not completely native level. He wouldn't have been mistaken for an Arab for a minute. But he was still, nevertheless, a very insightful observer on archaeologists' use of the language and their interaction with workforces. Ancient languages might be thought of as potentially being a bit of a help to people who would have been acquiring other languages in the field. We might work from the assumption that an openness to other languages would extend itself to Arabic and other things in the Middle East. In fact, we have evidence that this is not necessarily really the case. We have at least one example here, Father S.J. Burrows, who dug with Woolley at Ur, who we know, this is from Max Mallow's account in the 1970s, was great with ancient languages, not just Latin and Greek, but Middle Eastern ancient languages which were related to Arabic, things like, well, not Sumerian, but Babylonian, Phoenician, Aramaic, and Hebrew, things that are part of the same language family as Arabic. But he was unable to bend his mind to the vernacular and had the greatest difficulty in asking for a jar of hot water in Arabic. For Mallowan himself, it was tricky as well, and at this point I'm going to, maybe these are in different directions, it's the same book in different editions. Around the room, copies of the book which Mallowan is referring to here, which is Van Esse's Arabic, and Mallowan says that he's been keeping this in his pocket for several years on end and has become tolerably confident in speaking and understanding, and by a dialectal method of question and answer, which stood me in good stead during the war, when better Arabists were often unable to put their Arabic across. By better Arabists, of course, he means people who have a conventional scholastic training in the classical language. Van Esse's grammar, which I'm circulating there, there are two copies. One is, I think, 1915, one I think is late 19th century. Both have been annotated by previous users, which is something that I've been able to take advantage in my current research by trying to have a look at the ways in which people actually work towards using these books to teach themselves some Arabic. But of course, this is always a best case scenario. Max Mallowan, we've got, in fact, Agatha Christie's, Mallowan's wife's memoirs here, talking about the archaeologist Robin McCartney, who also had a classical education. But we have here the perspective of a local worker called Hamoudi, relating to Mallowan that he has attempted to have conversations with McCartney, but alas, not even now, after 2 months, does the Khwaja Mac understand a word of Arabic. Max asks Mac how he is getting on with Van Esse's spoken Arabic. There's a loaded question. Mac replies that he seems to have mislaid it. Perhaps a moment to think back to some of these completely pristine copies of Arabic textbooks and phrase books that we have from the late 19th century. Coming back again a little bit from language to intermediaries, I wanted to say a bit about a project that completely absorbed me for a couple of years. In 2014, I was on eBay and I came across a notebook, a set of papers, which had belonged to a Palestinian dragoman, which had a series of letters from clients talking about his services. And this is a book which he used to solicit their services. These letters often say things about Solomon Najima, the dragoman in question's knowledge of antiquities and ancient history, and in particular Old Testament history as well. One which is of particular interest This is a letter written in 1892, and it's by it's by an organised tour group, Gaze's Palestine Party, travelling with a company run by Henry Gaze as tours in the Middle East. To whom it may concern, it's seldom that we give a recommendation as heartily as we give this one of Suleiman Najima, dragoman. He understands his business thoroughly. He is versed in all the history and traditions of Syria and Palestine, and the most dutiful students of the Bible will value his opinions most highly. He can be perfectly, underlined, trusted to make bargains for his party, and will give them every advantage of reduced price. We have formed a very high opinion of his character and shall recommend him to our friends as the most deservable dragoman we have met. Most of these letters have a reasonably similar narrative to them, recommending, talking about knowledge of history. But this one I liked in particular because when you go through the names on it, this is a group of motorists. They're not necessarily just random tourists who may have some knowledge of the ancient world. We've got people who are educated, and they're particularly interesting is the one who's written at the end, most cordially, Miss S.A. Emerson, Wellesley, Massachusetts, USA. She's not Miss S.A. Emerson, she's Professor Emerson. And she was initially a professor of classics, and then a professor of, I think, Old Testament studies, Semitic linguistics at Wellesley College. And in 1903, a few years after this, she gained a PhD from Yale as well. So I think it's difficult to compartmentalize archaeologists and ancient historians and tourists off completely from each other. And I think that having a look at things to do with the tourist trade here as well can give quite a number of insights into the scholarly, into the archaeological side too. This isn't necessarily related to classical archaeology, but it's too good an anecdote not to bring in. Suleiman Najima was a bit of a character, as well as his letters, which I published in a book which came out with Bloomsbury in paperback last year, as well as his letters in the book. We've got mentions of him in a number of contemporary accounts by travellers that met him and used his services. One of whom is Marmaduke Pickthall, later Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall, who wasn't a tourist. He was a young man who, in his late teens, failed the entrance exams. Well, it passed, but didn't do quite well enough to get into the Levant Consular Service. So his mum thought it'd be a good idea to pack him off in a gap year to the Middle East, where he would magically acquire Oriental languages and then come back and breeze his way into the Foreign Service. He didn't do this. He went off and he had a really, really good time in Egypt and Palestine and Syria. And along the way, he made friends with Solomon. He refers to him as Suleiman, and gives lots of interesting insights into how he interpreted history to his audience, often while touring archaeological sites or seeking to promote identifications of archaeological sites with particular things in texts as well. He phrases things very delicately. He's writing in a much, much more delicate age as Pickthall. And he's talking about, in the 1890s, an American admiral who was ashore in Palestine for 2 days, asked only one thing: to be shown the tree on which Judas Iscariot had hanged himself, in order that he might defile it in a natural manner. He means peeing on the tree, if anyone's wondering what we're getting at here. And so it has his faith. And Solomon, lo and behold, was able to conduct him to the very tree and to make the journey occupy exactly the time specified. The American was satisfied and wrote him out a handsome testimonial. I hope you see where we're going with this. We have the testimonial. It's in Solomon's book. This is Rear Admiral M.A. Kirkland, who was quite a controversial figure. He got himself involved in all sorts of political arguments in the Middle East as well. There's nothing in this about trees, let's just say. So he's writing this very kind of, he's recommending, but giving the recommendation in quite a bland way. He makes references to his knowledge of history of Palestine, archaeological sites, things like that. Doesn't mention the one particular historic tree which he was interested in being shown. So I'm going to wind up about there. As I said, a lot of what I've talked about is related to some projects which are published already, some which are already which are currently in the process of coming into being, which lie at the intersection between looking at archaeology as a discipline and looking at popular interest in history and antiquities in the Middle East in the 19th and early 20th century. So we have here again on the right-hand side of the slide our friend Petrie, and on the left, that's a picture that we have of Suleiman Mujima dressed up in his riding boots and breeches, ready to take tourists on tours of archaeological sites. If people are interested in following up things like this a bit more, I'd like to invite you, if you happen to be in Cairo in April, to a fabulous event that I and some colleagues are putting on at the Egypt Exploration Society called Orientalism, the Classics and Egypt. We're hoping to make this an annual workshop. We did it last year, we're doing it this year, we're making plans for the next one as well. Talking about the ways in which colonial history interacts with scholarship on the ancient Middle East and Egypt, and more specifically on classical scholarship as well. I didn't say much about things that were specifically classical today, because so many of the sites that these archaeologists worked at were multi-period. But in this project, we're taking interest specifically in classics in Egypt as well. So thank you very much for your attention.
So much interesting material there to reflect on, especially for those of us who work in the Middle East and feel like a lot of our responsibilities, language learning, and what we teach our students. I was really struck at the beginning because I thought the word anecdote was like a metaphor. So like, he put it down to his head, and the gun was, a signed permit, but it's an actual gun.
Actual gun, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I was shocked when I read that for the first time, and I don't think it's straightforward. I don't think it's evil bad imperialist guns either. I think this is a really, really complicated encounter, which is not just about Woolley talking to locals. He talks about having good relationships with the locals at that point. So this is frustration with the Turkish officials, and which is very good to talk about as well.
Yeah, it just brings up that the first photography happening in Egypt, and stay still. This is a gun. Stay still. Sorry.
Leading on from what you were saying, we take a pinch of salt whether Woolley would actually or really did threaten him. I mean, with all these situations where you're writing about confrontation with communism, bloody killed that bloke, but he wouldn't.
He goes into great detail about this. Like, he does say that he wouldn't have actually shot him, but he makes a point of saying the Turkish official didn't know that. This is not something he's saying casually. This is something that he describes in really great detail.
But on the other hand, you are in a sort of Wild West kind of situation. I have been in situations in the Middle East where which has been on the foot, where I'm trying to get something done, and the person when I'm trying to get it done, he's the one with the gun. He's threatening me. So
depends on the situation you get into. I think this is not a life or death situation. We can talk about the rights and wrongs of this at great length, of course, but this was not a life and death situation until the guns into this stage of mine archaeologists. Yeah, of course it did. Yeah, absolutely, it worked. Yeah, sorry, I should have added the official capitulates immediately as a portion of the route. If someone comes into your office and goes like this, and says, I want my permit, the official says, okay, here it is. I imagine it was kind of awkward. I don't think they were hanging out with each other and you know, I believe they hadn't done much after that. Don't survive. Samples, yeah. Yeah. I'm very aware of the being sample bias with that. I've tried to get hold of as many copies of these as I can. But it does seem to be the case that there is, you know, the kinds of things that you wouldn't expect to survive. I'm not talking about ones like the dynamics that I have to you know, these are just standard, but very, very flimsy paperback things. There are a surprising number of determinant conditions. So yes, I absolutely agree that by definition the ones we have are the ones that won't but use these cases, but it's still remarkable how many of them there are. What I should probably do is have a look at the extent to which this is true for other languages as well. So how many students think about French basics, for example, in that thing. Yeah, so I accept that there's a problem with the sample there. A lot of this is grounded in painful personal experience of trying to get through that hour of living many years and still not being there. No, I think it was Mallory, I think. Yeah.
He's a marketing.
Right. Yeah, I'll have a look into that. Yeah, definitely.
I'm just wondering if another source of sort of issues quite often you find people have very
Yeah, Stephen Clark's work on the Teaching Museum archives has come up with a really, if people that read that book, I recommend it so strongly, and I've got fabulous stuff and pictures notes of Arabic as well. I've been, I've got funding applications into this project at the minute, and we've touched with and if these come through, then that's something I really hope to do, have a look at archaeological archives and see how much Arabic is and things like that.
and somebody else who probably don't know actually some other things to that a couple of years ago I got around to my and he's got information on Arabic language and he gave it to Hardy and
I'd love to see that. We should stick send contact details. I'd really love to see that. There's think it's in Birmingham down here this evening. April, the American Centre for Oriental Research in Milan, had an Arabic for archaeologists book, which is based on things from previous decades. It's an April one. It's quite small. I think in terms of, yeah.
Really awesome for the 60s in this country, so I think all over the world in the 1930s. Really want a single Arabic phrase, not a, it's close to Richard Bell talking about instance in Arabic, but it just was a lack of engagement, on parts.
I just want to say about the unused book, and yes, it is useful to see how many books there are for European. I think one of the problems with Arabic particularly is the reaching the fact that there are so many dialects. I knew some Arabic and I went put myself out to read. And so when I was in London, I picked up a book that contained transliteration in Arabic script. This isn't done 20 years ago. And I took it back to my Palestinian flatmates back in Oman, and he just read it and he felt about laughing. Yeah, it's not laughing, you know it.
Yeah, it's a big problem. It's something that archaeologists reflect on a lot as well. I mean, I've found it going from my straight from field season in northern Nile Delta one year to one in southern Jordan, and not much Arabic was being spoken. My own Arabic was not great, but it was very, very obvious to me that when I went with somebody to hand me, those black buckets being made out of tiles. Yeah, that I was. It was, we were saying we were calling them Makkah in Egypt, and we were calling it Guta in southern Jordan, both of which are mangled pronunciations of what locals are actually calling them, and neither of which you're going to find in Hansberg's Arabic dictionary.
That's the other thing, in ourself situated, because you learn pidgin Arabic because that's where they teach it to you, the student follows can understand, and then that sort of becomes a part of the whole thing, so you think it's normal.
Yeah, I mean, I've been in gigs where there've been little songs in Arabic that we've sung in the trenches, which have been Arabic written, made up by foreigners, which I really, really hope nobody ever sang with international local Arabic speakers. It's terrible. Yeah. And you get some little things that can cause big confusions, like Arabia in Egypt being word used for car, but it's wheelbarrow if you use it somewhere else. It's little things like that that make a really, really big difference.
It's no reflection of different cars in Egypt.
Oh, well, actually, no, we didn't think about that. I'm not concerned kind of things for Egyptian cars.
Well, Orientalism that's embedded in a lot of this. I was very struck by that image you showed, the cartoon of Herodotus as the Westerner.
Isn't it appalling?
The gullible Westerner and the pharaoh type figure as the wily Oriental.
Yeah.
And I was also struck in another page you showed with the typical Arabic, but the strong verb in Arabic being to govern.
Yes.
And I wondered whether you actually spoke back those people, one of these is visual, but then it's got used in that very casual fix environment. There are a lot of messages daily in strange books about social hierarchy and race and class and gender.
I didn't go into that much because I spent 2 hours this morning explaining Orientalism to a bunch of undergraduates. So I was kind of sided out by this point in the day. But yes, absolutely. It's a really fascinating thing you can get out of these materials. The cartoon, it's Orientalist, it's racist as well. We've got, Herodotus, the Greek is your American or European tourist. You've got a dark-skinned Egyptian is a present-day dragoman, and the vocab as well. I mean, even things like Petrie's list, Al-Falahin Majnain, peasants are foolish. There are so many loaded things that come across in it, which is one of the reasons I love Yakub Nafla's book so much, because it's, actual nice conversations getting to know people over a beer, rather than talking about, governing things.
What's the date of the cartoon?
This is 1906.
Oh, it's the same.
Yeah,
it's in the book.
It's in the book. It's the part of the illustrations for the book. Yeah.
Is there any evidence of obvious evidence of archaeologists actually being misled because of their lack of knowledge of the local, other than the pure physical?
We probably wouldn't know if that were the case of things. People tend not necessarily to reflect on their own weaknesses and things as much as they do in their own strengths in knowing some Arabic. We probably wouldn't get archaeologists being aware in that case if there were a specific linguistic thing which we're getting in the way.
I think there are a couple more general cases from late 19th century southern Iraq, both American, just to do with complete ignorance of the language, meaning very complete failure to interact with local people who are then drive them off the archaeological site because it is their land, and the fact that they've got a permit means nothing because the local people aren't literate, and certainly don't read much with Arabic. So the famous expedition to Nickel, the American expedition to Nickel, they all turn up in the desert with their bicycles. It's just, they're a fantastic photograph of me. None of them speak anything like the way real Iraqi Arabic. And obviously, you should ask for their treatment of the gardens. And then there's another, a few years later, another American, Banks, who is exposed for Chicago, and his workmen have worked with the German nearby, and Banks is basically just wanting to loot the stuff to take back to the Orient Institute in Chicago. And his workmen say, well, that's not the way we're trained. Very much. We're trained to do it properly, the German way. And so they have this long sort of, and he reports this himself, and it's very sort of, in his own, this is Banks writing later, and this is autobiographical account of what goes on. And there it's not so much about language, but it's about acknowledging who's the expert. And eventually his Iraqi foreman persuades him to go to the German dig, have a look at what they're doing. Maybe you could do some thing with me, perhaps.
Maybe, yeah.
And Banks comes back and they're like, they haven't found anything, it's rubbish. And you can just imagine the Iraqi foreman going by.
Yeah. You get, that makes me think as well of Lawrence, I forget what season it is. It's somewhere, I think it's Carchemish, or if it's not, it's somewhere near that. And he shows up at the beginning of one season and goes and has a catch up with the workmen, sits down, has a cup of tea, has a chat with them, and finds that they're full of hilarious stories about how awful the German archaeologists were who'd just been there. And they're all doing impersonations of the Germans, who they make a point of saying don't speak any Arabic. So the local Arabic workers are now, Arabic-speaking workers are now sort of, mimicking all of these German swear words that they've heard people cursing and saying, which is, Lawrence finds very amusing.
If you want to hear the swear words, we should probably turn off the Google Hangout thing that's happening. So thank you again, Rachel, very much. I hope everyone can join us for drinks. But thank you and shukran very much. I don't want it to see you shut on my laptop.